May 4th, 1980, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. It's a Sunday afternoon. At around 6 p.m., television programs across the nation are interrupted by an urgent announcement. The news that follows sends the people of Yugoslavia into shock.
Umro je drug Tito. To su večeras saopštili Centralni komitet Saveza komunista Jugoslavije i predsjedništvo Socijalističke federativne republike Jugoslavije, radničkoj klasi, radnim ljudima i građanima, narodima i narodnostima Socijalističke federativne republike Jugoslavije.
The news is earth-shattering. Josip Broz Tito, the man who has led Yugoslavia for nearly 40 years, is dead at age 87. Tito had achieved almost mythical status during his decades at the helm, from his actions as a brave partisan fighter in World War II, helping liberate Yugoslavia from the Nazis, to his larger-than-life presence on the world stage as founder and leader of the non-aligned movement. Yugoslavia plunged into a period of mourning. Men and women wept openly. Many had the sense that without Tito's guidance, the nation itself could not long survive. Josip Broz Tito's funeral on May 8th was a global event. Still considered the most attended state funeral in history, the event hosted no less than 4 kings, 6 princes, 22 prime ministers, 31 presidents, and scores of other dignitaries, speaking to Tito's status as an international power broker. As with all political leaders, Tito's legacy wasn't remembered fondly by all. His secret police had arrested and imprisoned hundreds of political dissidents over the years, many of whom were held in harsh conditions in prison camps like the notorious Goli Otok. Tito's legacy is a complicated one. There's a reason he's often included on that very short list of, quote, benevolent dictators. But his death was felt in some personal way by practically every person who called Yugoslavia home. At the height of the Cold War, when the world was divided into 2 ideological camps, Tito had maintained a working relationship with both sides, giving Yugoslavia a unique position on the international stage as a communist country that was not part of the Soviet bloc. Unlike the rest of Eastern Europe, where the Soviets liberated the masses from the Nazis, the Yugoslavs had largely liberated themselves. Tito made it clear to Stalin early on that Yugoslavia would not be a Soviet puppet state. Tito forged a different path for his country, founding the Non-Aligned Movement, an association of countries aligned with neither the US nor the Soviets. Member states included countries like India, Pakistan, and Indonesia. The Non-Aligned Movement survives to this day. Though Yugoslavia was a one-party state, the country had a reputation for being more humane and permissive than the other Eastern Bloc nations. Residents could travel abroad with few restrictions and were allowed significantly more civic freedoms than their Soviet counterparts. Western tourists were welcomed as an important revenue stream, and Yugoslavia was renowned for its beautiful resorts on the Adriatic coast. The party slogan was Bratstvo I Jedinstvo, brotherhood and unity. But unity was a fragile thing in a country that was home to over a dozen different ethnic groups, some of which had viewed one another with distrust, if not outright hostility, for centuries. As head of state, Tito kept a tight lid on ethnic and nationalist sentiments. In 1971, for example, the Yugoslav authorities succeeded in squashing a revival of Croat nationalism and either jailing or exiling its leaders. These heavy-handed tactics were viewed as a necessary evil by those loyal to the ideal of Yugoslavia as a stable multi-ethnic state. And as long as Tito was alive, the nation was held together, if only by the mere force of his presence. His picture adorned public buildings and even private homes. Tito wasn't just the face of Yugoslavia. To many, he was Yugoslavia. A new constitution was adopted in 1974, which established how the 6 constituent republics were to govern themselves. This constitution decentralized much of the state apparatus, giving significant powers to the republics themselves, and enacted a pretty complex system of government. Understanding this system is essential to understanding the crises that would later tear the country apart. Each of Yugoslavia's 6 republics, Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, and Montenegro, was given its own central bank, its own educational and judicial system, and its own police force. The same were granted to both of Serbia's autonomous provinces, Vojvodina and Kosovo. This elevated Vojvodina and Kosovo to full constituent membership, a move that didn't exactly sit well with most Serbs, who felt that Serbia, as Yugoslavia's largest republic and home to Belgrade, the federal capital, was being diminished in status. This would begin years of Serbian challenges to the 1974 constitution. At the same time, this change alleviated many of the fears of the smaller republics, who had complained for decades that the balance of power in Yugoslavia was unfairly skewed in favor of Serbia. Tito, who himself was half Croat and half Slovene, sympathized with fears of Serb dominance, and knew that it took a delicate balancing act to keep all 6 republics content. The 74 Constitution was intended to lay the groundwork for a stable and unified Yugoslavia that could survive after the death of its leader. In reality, it was only the firm hand of Tito himself that was keeping ethno-nationalist tensions suppressed. As much as the idea of a Yugoslav national identity was emphasized over ethnic divisions, it never took root among the people. For example, if you were to ask a Yugoslav in 1980 where they were from, a typical answer would be, "I'm a Serb," or "I'm a Croat," but much less frequently would you hear, "I'm Yugoslavian." Yugoslav identity was beginning to take shape in the younger generations by the early 80s, but as history would prove, it was too little, too late. As Tito's health began to rapidly decline towards the end of 1978, and with a clear lack of any one man he considered a worthy successor, Tito formulated a succession plan that would prove to be as inefficient as it was complicated. He would leave power in the hands of an 8-man rotating presidency, one representative from each of the 8 constituent republics and provinces, who would step into the role of president for individual rotating 1-year terms. The head of this collective presidency would wear the title President of the Presidency for his or her respective 1-year term, though the position itself was largely symbolic. In addition to the rotating presidency, Yugoslavia was governed by a federal executive council, comparable to the executive branch in the US or the cabinet in the UK. Its head, also called the president, functioned as the head of government, comparable to the Prime Minister of the UK or the Chancellor of Germany. To further complicate matters, Yugoslavia was a federation. Each of its 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces was in itself a complete functioning state, with its own presidency and executive council, separate from the Yugoslav federal government in Belgrade. So you could be talking about the president of the presidency of Montenegro and still not be talking about the president of the presidency of Yugoslavia itself. The first few years after Tito's death, things in Yugoslavia proceeded more or less without incident. In 1984, Sarajevo, the beautiful capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, hosted the Winter Olympics and showcased Yugoslav brotherhood and unity for the whole world to see. Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular had the most ethnically diverse population of all the republics. Just under half the population were Bosnian Muslims, known as Bosniaks. The other half was divided between Orthodox Serbs and Catholic Croats. Though Serbs tended to be concentrated around the city of Banja Luka, it was one of the peculiarities of Bosnia that a single small village could be home to all 3 ethnic groups, with family ties going back centuries. Communist authorities in Sarajevo managed to keep a tight lid on this powder keg by clamping down on all signs of ethno-nationalism. When nationalist expressions first broke out in the 80s, it wasn't from Bosnia but from Serbia. In September 1986, the Serbian Academy of Arts and Sciences released a paper that would become known as the Memorandum. Through all the crises that would follow over the next decade, Yugoslavs by and large would point to the Memorandum as the beginning of the end. The document, written by a group of Serbian academics, brought up a number of Serb grievances that challenged the official party line of brotherhood and unity. Serbia, the memorandum claimed, was the victim of systematic anti-Serb prejudice that had demoted the Serbs to second-class citizens within their own country. Chief among the grievances were the provisions in the 1974 Constitution that gave Vojvodina and Kosovo more autonomy from Serbia and a bigger say in their own governance. Serbs believed these provinces should be brought back under the exclusive authority of Serbia, particularly where Kosovo was concerned. The question of Kosovo looms large in Serbian history. This region is Serbia's southeast corner, is considered by Serbs to be their spiritual and ancestral homeland. Kosovo was both the geographic core of the medieval Serbian Empire and the seat of the Serbian Orthodox Church, not to mention the site of the Battle of Kosovo, where the Serbs were defeated by the Ottoman Empire in 1389, an event that holds almost mystical significance in Serbian lore. By the 20th century, Kosovo was populated almost exclusively by ethnic Albanians, Serbs making up only around 10% of the population, a situation that was no small source of irritation to the Serbs in Belgrade, who believed that any suggestion of Kosovo's independence from Serbia was non-negotiable. Serbs in 1986 were still pretty bitter about the 1974 constitution that gave Kosovo more autonomy than they believed was appropriate. The memorandum gave voice to these concerns. For the first time in generations, Serb nationalism was brought into the open. At first, even Serbian communist leaders condemned the memorandum, calling it dangerously subversive and a threat to Yugoslavia's very existence. But its message was adamantly embraced by the very vocal Serb minority in Kosovo, who for years had been complaining of mistreatment at the hands of the Albanian majority. The Kosovo Serbs began staging demonstrations across the country demanding that Serbia assert its authority in the province. The rallies drew thousands, and the Serbian communist authorities found the movement increasingly hard to ignore. Enter Slobodan Milosevic. The man whose name would later be synonymous with the Yugoslav wars started out as a young Communist Party functionary in Belgrade. For all his faults, he was ambitious and was a man who could tell which way the wind was blowing and how to use it to his advantage. Milosevic was a close friend of Ivan Stambolic, the president of Serbia. Stambolic's misfortune at that time was that he underestimated the popular appeal of the Kosovo Serbs' message and woefully misjudged the general mood of the Serbian public at the time. When in 1987 he sent Milosevic in his place to meet with the Kosovo Serbs and hear their demands, this decision backfired spectacularly. The Kosovo Serbs were insulted that Stambolic didn't appear to take their grievances seriously and had sent Milosevic in his place. But Milosevic, accurately sensing the mood of the hour, took up their cause personally. He became the spokesman for the aggrieved Serb everywhere. Almost overnight, Milosevic's popularity soared while Stambolic's plummeted. With a good deal of shrewd maneuvering, Milosevic worked behind the scenes to undermine Stambolic and to portray him as a weak leader. In this newly charged political atmosphere, any criticism of Serbian nationalism was painted as support for Albanian separatism. Milosevic managed to stack the deck against Stambolic and saw to it that the president and his allies were steamrolled right out of power. Stambolic would later say that this betrayal by Milosevic was something he never even saw coming. Events thereafter developed quickly. Milosevic consolidated power in the Serbian parliament, purging opponents from the party. He ordered a police crackdown on Albanian activists in Kosovo, a move that increased his popularity with the Serbian public. He also spearheaded what he called the anti-bureaucratic revolution, which he portrayed as a true mass movement but was actually a clever way to stack the Yugoslav presidency with Milosevic's allies. Meanwhile, the other Yugoslav republics looked on with trepidation as their old fears about an aggressive and expansionist Serbia appeared to be coming to life. In federal parliament, a Slovene delegate pointed his finger at a smug Milosevic and said, "Comrade Slobodan, think hard about which road you've chosen." Still, there were many who held on to a belief in the Yugoslav ideal, that the country could survive this crisis and the next if only it relied on continued diplomacy and compromise. In September 1988, the time for that illusion came to an end. The Serbian parliament, now stacked with Milosevic's allies, changed the 1974 constitution that had been such a thorn in Serbia's side. In a move that sent shockwaves through the federation, Kosovo was stripped of its autonomy. There were celebrations throughout Serbia. Many Serbs felt that the nation had finally been vindicated, that a historical wrong had been righted, and Serbia could hold its head high again. Albanians protesting the new constitution were brutally dispersed by tanks and riot police. This event, more than any other, set in motion the series of actions that would spell the end of Yugoslavia as a nation. Slovenia and Croatia, shocked and dismayed by the rise of Serb nationalism, argued that if Serbia could arbitrarily amend the constitution when it suited them, then the other republics had the same right. Slovenia in particular was experiencing a wave of pro-democracy protests and widespread public discontent, spurred on by what the Slovenes saw as their unfair position within the federation. Slovenia's situation was unique. The country's population made up only 8% of Yugoslavia's total, yet Slovenia contributed more than a third of Yugoslav hard currency exports. Slovenes had whispered among themselves for years that they gave much more to the Federation than they felt they got back. Slovenes also felt culturally different from their comrades. They were known as a tidy, industrious people shaped by Catholic values and a strong connection to their history as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yet despite their conservative reputation, Slovenes in their early 80s were the first Yugoslav people to undergo liberal reforms that took them away from one-party rule and toward a democratic and pluralistic future. Literature and the arts took on a decidedly dissident tone. One youth magazine, Mladina, repeatedly ran afoul of state censors in Belgrade. The situation came to a head in 1987 with the arrest of the Ljubljana Four, a group of pro-democracy activists who leaked plans by the Yugoslav army to impose martial law in Slovenia. The Slovene public was outraged and anti-Belgrade sentiments were at an all-time high. Serbia's changing of the constitution gave Slovene nationalists the out they'd been waiting for. In September of '88, the Slovene parliament introduced its own set of amendments, among them the right of republics to secede from the federation and the right of Slovenia to determine how its own revenues were allocated. The Serbs were infuriated, but it was clear that Milosevic himself bore the brunt of the blame for having opened the Pandora's box of self-determination. Borisav Jovic, Serbia's representative on the rotating federal presidency, would say later, "Milosevic and I believe that if the Slovenes passed the amendments, it would be the end of Yugoslavia." Subsequent events would prove them correct. Serbia maintained that the amendments were illegal, and Milosevic hoped that the Yugoslav army would intervene to keep Slovenia in line. But the army surprisingly argued for caution, believing it would set an ugly precedent if military force were used before all legal solutions were exhausted. In the end, both sides simply waited for the other to give in. Croatia and the other republics watched the standoff nervously. Slovenia's decision, whatever it might be, would have consequences for all of them. None of them, except Serbia naturally, fancied being members of a federation ruled by an increasingly aggressive Serbian majority. Only together could they maintain some sense of balance to counteract Milosevic. But if the first domino fell, the alliance was doomed. On September 27, 1989, Slovenia declared itself independent. As massive celebrations broke out across Slovenia, the mood in Belgrade was grim and defiant. Milosevic stated that he wasn't going to beg Slovenia to remain in Yugoslavia, blaming the independence movement on conservative reactionaries. In truth, Milosevic and his allies had already decided to let Slovenia go without much of a fight. The little nation was overwhelmingly ethnic Slovene. There was no Serb minority to speak of, unlike in Croatia and especially Bosnia, where Serbs made up significant minority communities. As far as Slovenia was concerned, the Serbs were content to watch them go. They were saving their energy for other fights to come. The 14th Party Congress in January 1990 would be Yugoslavia's last. Marred by insults and infighting, any attempt at compromise was shouted down. The Slovene delegates rose from their seats and walked out of the assembly hall as the Serb delegation jeered. To Milosevic's outrage, the Croatian delegates also stood up and walked out, joining their Slovene comrades. In the background of all this was Ante Markovic, the last prime minister of Yugoslavia. Ever the optimist, Markovic had spent his term pushing market reforms and attempting to ease the Yugoslav economy into the global market. Markovic had stabilized the dinar and managed to keep Yugoslavia from experiencing the hyperinflation that was plaguing the rest of the Eastern Bloc in the early 90s. For this, Markovic was a highly popular prime minister, and he hoped against all hope that a rising standard of living and other material improvements would supersede ethno-nationalist bickering. But the current was against him. Each of the 6 republics had its own territorial defense force, or TO, separate from the army, which functioned as a sort of national guard. Realizing the danger of these TOs being fully armed in the event civilians decided to start fighting for independence, the Yugoslav army began disarming the TOs in Slovenia and Croatia. Now would be a good time to talk about the Yugoslav army, or JNA. Fiercely disciplined and indoctrinated in communist ideology, the JNA prided itself in being the protector of the Yugoslav state. They maintained a reputation for being neutral in ethno-nationalist conflicts and operated pretty much independently of the government in Belgrade. As the prospect of republics leaving the Federation became a reality in 1991, the JNA found itself in an uncomfortable position. fight to keep the republics from leaving, and thus be seen as doing the bidding of Milosevic, or watch the republic secede and allow Yugoslavia to disintegrate and the army along with it. As the JNA was made up of recruits from every ethnic group, most Yugoslavs did not believe that it would fight for Serbian dominance. So in the early days of the conflict, the JNA largely played the role of cautious peacekeeper, but it would not stay in this role for long. When Slovenia was officially recognized as independent on June 25, 1991, Milosevic had already decided that the military response would be limited. JNA troops were deployed to, quote, secure the borders, but were actually getting into position for the coming fight with Croatia. In what would become known as the 10-Day War, or Phony War, Slovene Tito troops took control of JNA facilities largely without a fight. A few skirmishes took place. One JNA helicopter was shot down while conducting reconnaissance and resupplying a barracks, but the crisis passed, and Slovenia was allowed to leave Yugoslavia. At the following Brioni Accords, the JNA agreed to a full withdrawal from Slovenia. Total casualties from the 10-Day War were very low, 44 JNA troops killed in action, and 19 Slovenes. The focus now turned to Croatia, which was clearly next in line for secession. Serbia had a much bigger dog in this fight. An entire swath of Croatia, known as the Serb Krajina, contained a significant Serb population. These Croatian Serbs had watched uneasily as Croat nationalism began to rematerialize in 1989. During Tito's reign, and especially after his crackdown on Croat nationalism in the 70s, Croatia had gained the nickname the Silent Republic, as all references to Croatian national identity were kept under wraps. There was good reason for this. World War II still haunted Yugoslav society with the ghosts of the past. Croatia had established a pro-Nazi fascist state under Ante Pavelic and his Ustaša regime. Serbs, Jews, and other minorities were murdered by the tens of thousands, many in the Jasenovec death camp. After the fall of the Ustaša dictatorship, nationalist symbols like the Šahovnica coat of arms were banned due to their association with Ustaša brutality. Serbs who had been a primary target of the mass murder campaign were understandably wary of any revival of Croat nationalism. Under the 1974 constitution, the Serb minority even enjoyed special status within the Croat nation, and they made up a good chunk of the bureaucracy and police force despite being only 13% of the population. 1989 saw the revival of the Croatian Democratic Union, or HDZ, a party which quickly became the mouthpiece of the nationalist cause. In the midst of Milosevic's calls for a greater Serbia, the Silent Republic had finally found a voice. Croats feared the newly assertive Serb identity, just as Serbs feared the reappearance of Ustaša symbols and a growing Croat identity movement. Franjo Tudjman stepped into the role of HDZ leader. His warnings of a coming, quote, Serboslavia found a welcome audience. Particularly loyal to Tudjman were the Croats of Herzegovina, who made up the largest Croat community in Yugoslavia outside of Croatia proper. Tudjman repaid their support with calls for Herzegovina to be detached from Bosnia and incorporated into Croatia. This attitude towards Bosnia and Herzegovina was common among Serbs and Croats. Many believed that Bosniaks, that is Bosnian Muslims, rather than being a distinct ethnic group, were merely Serbs and Croats who had converted to Islam during centuries of Ottoman rule. There were numerous covert discussions between Serbia and Croatia in the early 90s of what to do with Bosnia and Herzegovina. One idea was to carve up the country and divide it between themselves. In Croatia's case, much of present-day Bosnia was once part of Croatian territory, including Sarajevo itself, as recently as the 1940s. And throughout the Middle Ages, Bosnia was ruled and inhabited by both Serbs and Croats, with no strict demarcation between lands. Many Serbs and Croats never accepted Bosnia's geopolitical legitimacy, believing the territory rightfully belonged to them. This issue would come into play later. For now, Belgrade's attention was focused on Croatia and to Franjo Tudjman and his HDZ. In May 1990, the HDZ won an absolute majority in the Croatian elections. At Tudjman's inauguration, the communist Red Star was replaced by the Šahovnica. The brazen display of this divisive symbol was an outrage to the Serbs, and played well with Belgrade propaganda that suggested the Ustaša killers were making a comeback. The situation intensified when the Serbs' protected minority status was dropped from the new constitution. This had the double effect of not only further radicalizing many of the Serbs in Krajina, but also alienating those moderate Serbs who supported Croatian independence. Croatia furthermore began firing Serbs en masse from its police force and government positions. In response, Milosevic made it clear that Serbia would not permit Croatia to leave the Federation without giving its Serbs complete autonomy, something the new Croatia wasn't willing to give. Things continued to deteriorate throughout 1990. The city of Knin became a hotbed of Serbian separatist activity. A branch of the radical SDS party was established there, and further branches popped up all over Serb Krajina. Moderate Serb mayors and civic leaders were purged by SDS members, who soon consolidated their grip on what was now being called the Republic of Serb Krajina. Emerging as the leader of Serbs in Krajina was Milan Babic, a dentist by profession who had grown up hearing horror stories of his family's treatment at the hands of the Ustasha. Babic traveled around Serb Krajina, rallying Serbs and urging them to organize militias. He joined forces with Milan Martic, a Serb policeman who had refused to wear the new Croat police uniform, which featured the despised šahovnica. Martic became the head of paramilitary operations as the Serbs began arming themselves. Serb villagers used logs to set up barriers around their towns to keep out Croats, a movement nicknamed the Log Revolution. Open hostilities broke out in February of 91 when Serb militants seized the police station in the town of Pakvac. Croats took the station back only for JNA tanks to roll in order to, quote, separate warring factions. This was the first JNA intervention in Croatia, and it set the pattern for conflict to follow. Serb militias would provoke a response from Croat authorities, Croats would engage, and the JNA would step in under the guise of keeping the peace. In reality, the JNA protected and preserved Serbian gains. At this time, the JNA was still able to say it was protecting Yugoslavia, as many of the generals still held to their Titoist ideals. Though they were gradually being replaced by Serb nationalists, whatever the reasoning, the army was protecting Serb interest in Croatia. On March 15, 91, Milosevic declared, "Yugoslavia is finished." He no longer considered Serbia bound by Yugoslav federal law. It would be unfair to say that Milosevic and his nationalist allies enjoyed a popular mandate from the Serbian public. There were widespread protests in Belgrade, especially in March of 91, when 500,000 marched in the streets to protest Milosevic and his rule, but these protests were put down pretty harshly. Milosevic exercised an iron grip on Serbian media and on the police force, and protest movements faced an uphill battle. Over the summer of 1991, Milan Martic and his forces took control of village after village in Serb Krajina. There were sporadic bursts of violence all over Croatia that summer. Masked men with AK-47s guarded roadblocks. Militias interrogated and harassed citizens. There were bursts of gunfire in the night. Moderate Croat officials were targeted and assassinated by HDZ radicals. In the Serb-populated town of Borovo Selo, a group of Croat policemen carried out a raid in an attempt to put the Croatian flag back up over the town, after Serb militants replaced it with the Yugoslav flag. They drove right into an ambush. 12 Croat policemen were killed. The massacre led to further violence in the area as Croats carried out reprisal attacks on local Serbs. These tit-for-tat reprisal killings became the order of the day. As the violence escalated, the Croatian right wing pressured President Tudjman to declare war on Serbia. He resisted this, believing the best bargaining chip Croatia could have was international recognition of its independence. His defense minister even resigned in protest when Tudjman refused to deploy the National Guard. The president had his reasons for reluctance. Croatia's main fighting force was its police, the TO having been largely disarmed by the JNA at this point. And the police force, after having fired so many experienced Serbs, filled up with inexperienced and undisciplined young HDZ recruits. But Tudjman wouldn't need to wait long for events to force his hand. On August 26, the JNA, acting for the first time in conjunction with Serb militias, attacked the small town of Kijevo. Backed by the Yugoslav Air Force, they laid waste to the town, destroying every structure and looting whatever remained. Outraged, Croatia declared war that same day. Responsibility for the Kijevo annihilation lay with Ratko Mladic, a name that would become synonymous with the brutality of the Balkan Wars. Mladic was a Bosnian Serb who joined forces with Martic and waged a fearsome campaign of terror and destruction wherever his militias went. He enforced a policy that became known as ethnic cleansing, the forced removal of non-Serbs from a town or region through intimidation, deportation, or outright murder. The goal was to cleanse Serb Krajina of all Croats. Kijevo was only the first example. There would be many more to come. Immediately upon Croatia's declaration of war, Serb forces moved into the city of Vukovar. The city underwent brutal shelling for the next 2.5 months, filling the streets with debris and bodies. Vukovar gained the nickname Croatia's Stalingrad. Not until November 18th did Vukovar's defenders surrender to Ratko Mladic. Serb militia units immediately rounded up 260 men and drove them to a large storage shed outside town, where they were gunned down and then dumped into several mass graves. Massacres like this would become a gruesome feature of the Balkan Wars, not least because Mladic considered all captured males of fighting age to be prisoners of war, regardless of their true combatant status. The frequency and body counts would both increase later in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where they made global headlines, but the mass murder started in Croatia. Throughout October, Serbs made impressive territorial gains and expanded the borders of Serb Krajina. After the fall of Vukovar, the Serbs advanced westward toward Osijek, burning and looting Croat-populated villages along the way. Upon reaching Osijek, they encountered strong resistance from Croat forces, so they held short of the city and began another siege. This pause in the advance was well-timed, as Milosevic was hesitant to take Osijek, fearing that further incursions into Croat-majority areas would not play well on the international stage. The Serbs of Krajina by this time had met virtually all of their military objectives, along with cleansing the territory almost totally of Croats. The Republic of Serb Krajina was Serb-occupied, at least for the time being. In December 1991, Iceland became the first country to recognize Croatia's independence, and in January of 1992, Croatia was officially recognized by the European Community, the precursor to the European Union. A ceasefire between Croatia and Serbia was negotiated on January 2nd, which both sides would more or less honor for the next year. Though Croatia had lost a great deal of territory, General Anton Tus had managed to turn the ragtag Croat defense forces into a disciplined army of 250,000 men. Peace talks proceeded with no small amount of obstructions. Lord Carrington, a British diplomat, tabled a reasonable peace plan that would have respected Croatian independence while giving national minorities like Serbs generous rights and protections. Also known as the Lisbon Agreement, it would have divided Croatia and Bosnia into cantons, like what we find in Switzerland. However, the plan was sunk by Slobodan Milosevic, who realized that if Serbs in Croatia were given wide-ranging rights and autonomy, Serbia would be expected to grant the same to Albanians in Kosovo. The Lisbon Agreement was nixed. The Vance Plan had a better reception. Named for U.S. diplomat Cyrus Vance, the plan proposed the establishment of 3 special UN-protected zones, or UNPAs, to be administered by UN peacekeepers while Croatia and Serbia worked out a longer-term solution. The Vance Plan was not so much a resolution to the conflict as it was a way to stop the violence long enough for negotiations to be completed. Milosevic eagerly supported the plan, believing that protected zones would freeze the front lines as they currently existed, eventually becoming de facto borders and enlarging Serbian territory. For now, the fighting in Croatia died down as JNA troops and hardware withdrew. Ominously, they didn't return to Serbia, but began amassing in Yugoslavia's mountainous Central Republic and the latest flashpoint of ethnic conflict, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Well, if you made it this far, thanks for tuning in. Part 2 should be out shortly. It's a little bit longer. But if you're interested in the topic, you might like it. Like or subscribe if you do. Maybe I'll start putting some videos up regularly. Special thanks to all my friends who speak Serbo-Croatian and are from the Balkans who help me with these pronunciations. A lot of them aren't very easy. So I'll see you in the next one. This was History Hooligan. See you later.